Post-stroke travel to Hawaii, number 1558, the 4th of March 2026. Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category: Neurology, Stroke Recovery. Preface: I had a stroke on June 21, 2025. After that event, I went through 8 months of testing, observation, and recovery. On February 28, 2026, I took my first air trip after the stroke and traveled to Honolulu, Hawaii. I intentionally used this trip as a real-life test to evaluate my post-stroke recovery status. During the first 3 days after arriving in Honolulu, I identified 3 clear observations about my current neurological condition. First, I discovered that I have lost some memories. Certain places, store names, or people that I used to know in Hawaii were initially missing from my memory. However, after making some effort to walk around the neighborhood and revisit familiar areas, many of those memories gradually came back piece by piece. Based on my current self-assessment, I estimate that I may have lost around 10% of my old memories. Second, my cognitive capability and research creativity appear to remain as strong as during the past. -1 months of recovery. New research ideas and insights from my medical datasets continue to emerge constantly. In fact, during this trip I even began to self-study epilepsy and seizure mechanisms as a new subject in my knowledge domain of neurology. Third, my emotional safeguard rail appears to be as soft as before. I am still easily touched by sad stories and by the difficult lives of poor people I encounter on the street. My emotional response to human suffering has not diminished after the stroke. Introduction. Stroke is one of the most common neurological events affecting the human brain. It occurs when blood supply to a portion of the brain is either blocked or disrupted. In ischemic stroke, the blood vessel becomes obstructed by a clot. In hemorrhagic stroke, the vessel wall ruptures and blood leaks into surrounding brain tissue. Although hemorrhagic strokes account for a smaller percentage of total stroke cases, around 10% to 15% of total cases, they often produce significant neurological symptoms because blood accumulation can directly disturb nearby neural networks. The brain operates as a highly interconnected electrical and chemical communication system. Different regions of the brain specialize in different functions, including motor control, language, spatial awareness, memory formation, and executive thinking. When a vascular event damages even a small portion of this network, the functional impact can be larger than the physical size of the injury would suggest. This occurs because the brain relies on communication pathways among many regions. A small disruption in one area may temporarily interrupt the ability of other regions to retrieve stored information. Stroke's impact is far more delicate, sensitive, and in some ways even more severe than the heart, kidney, and other organ diseases I have suffered before. I cannot fully explain it in very plain language. In my past 4 decades of professional career, I designed both electronic systems and mechanical or structural systems. The difference between semiconductor chips with their tiny transistors and thin wires, and large machinery or structural components may be similar to this biomedical feeling I am experiencing. Stroke has affected me in a way that feels very different from the heart, kidney, and other organ diseases I experienced between 1994 through 2010. Those illnesses certainly had physical consequences, but they did not disturb the center of perception itself. My brain remained intact, which allowed me to observe the disease, analyze it, and manage it in a relatively objective way. Stroke is different. It affects the very organ that performs observation, thinking, analysis, memory, and emotional response. Because of that, the experience feels much more delicate, sensitive, and in some way even more profound. It is difficult for me to explain this feeling in simple words. However, my past engineering experience provides an analogy that helps me describe it. Earlier in my career I worked on both electronic systems and mechanical or structural systems. I designed semiconductor-related systems that relied on extremely small transistors and microscopic wiring, and I also worked with much larger mechanical parts or structural components, including large piping systems in nuclear power plants in comparison with tiny wiring systems in a chip. Mechanical systems are usually robust. When damage occurs, it is often visible and localized. Cracking a pipe, deformation in a structure, or failure of a mechanical component can usually be identified clearly. The failure mechanism tends to be more direct and easier to understand. Semiconductor systems are very different. Their structures are extremely delicate. A tiny disturbance in a microscopic transistor or an almost invisible defect in a signal pathway can disrupt the illogic flow of the system. The physical damage may be extremely small, but its functional consequences can spread throughout the network. My personal biomedical experience with stroke feels much closer to the semiconductor chip system. The hemorrhage that occurred in the pontine location of my brain was physically small, yet its functional impact was much larger than I would have expected. Certain memories temporarily disappeared. Some cognitive pathways behaved differently. Emotional sensitivity also changed in subtle ways. In this sense, the brain behaves less like a mechanical structure and more like a complex electronic network. A small local disturbance can influence the behavior of the entire system because the brain operates through interconnected neural pathways. From a systems engineering perspective, I often describe the human body using simple functional analogies. My brain functions like the central processing unit CPU of the system, responsible for receiving signals, processing information, storing memory, and issuing commands. My heart works like a pump that drives the circulation of blood throughout the body. My kidneys operate like a filtration system, continuously removing waste and maintaining fluid balance. This way of thinking helps me understand why stroke feels so different from heart or kidney disease. When the pump or filtration system has problems, the brain as the control center can still observe and analyze the situation. But when the brain itself, the CPU chip of the system, is affected, even a small disturbance can influence the entire network of memory, perception, thinking, and actions. Another reason this experience is difficult to describe is that the brain is not only a biological organ. It is also the system that generates awareness, memory, and identity. When a heart or kidney is injured, the brain remains the observer of the disease. But when the brain itself is injured, the observer and the damaged system become the same entity. That makes the experience much more subtle and difficult to express. For me, this stroke has revealed how delicate and interconnected the brain truly is. Even a small structural event can produce wide functional changes. At the same time, the brain also shows remarkable adaptability as it reorganizes its internal networks during recovery. Stroke, however, the human brain also possesses an extraordinary ability called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's capacity to reorganize its neural networks after injury. When one pathway is damaged, other regions may gradually take over or strengthen alternative routes for communication. During this recovery process, some neurological functions may temporarily weaken while others become stronger or more active. This phenomenon explains why many stroke patients experience uneven recovery patterns. Some abilities return quickly, others recover slowly, and occasionally new cognitive strengths appear as the brain reorganizes its internal networks. The following personal observation describes my own experience during the post-stroke recovery period. It reflects the unusual combination of temporary memory disruption and enhanced cognitive pattern recognition that I have noticed after my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025. These earlier observations occurred again during my recent travel to Honolulu, Hawaii in late February and early March of 2026. Personal observation: I am still in the memory recovery phase after my hemorrhagic stroke on June 21, 2025. One thing that continues to surprise me is how such a small hemorrhage in the brain could cause multiple epilepsy event which further produced such a large impact on my memory. Certain memories, especially spatial ones such as street layouts, store names, or neighborhood landmarks, sometimes feel temporarily missing. For example, when I recently returned to my familiar neighborhood in Honolulu, I initially discovered that I had lost some memories of the streets and store names. However, after taking a short walk around the area, the memories gradually returned. This experience taught me that the memories were not completely erased. Rather, the retrieval pathways had become temporarily weakened and then reactivated through real-world experience. At the same time, I have noticed something very unusual on the opposite side of this recovery process. While some parts of my memory still require rebuilding, my cognitive capability in certain areas appears to have increased significantly. In particular, my ability to generate new ideas and recognize new patterns seems to have become 2 to 3 times stronger than before. New ideas come to my mind constantly, and I have clearly noticed this change in my daily thinking process, especially in my medical research work. I also discovered that I now have new angles to look at the same historical books or stories that I had already learned before. This paradox surprised me at first. How could a brain injury reduce some memory functions while simultaneously strengthening other mental capabilities? After observing myself carefully, I began to understand that this phenomenon may be related to the brain's process of neuroplasticity. When part of the brain is damaged, the brain does not remain static. Instead, it begins to reorganize its internal networks. Some neural pathways become weaker, while other pathways become stronger or more active. In other words, the brain attempts to redistribute its functional workload across different regions. This situation is highly similar to opening some old filing drawers to retrieve certain forgot files. These discoveries explain how I am now able to apply stochastic processes and topology theory to subjects I learned 5 to 6 decades ago but had not applied since then. After my stroke, I can now suddenly use them in my ongoing medical research. Worked out in my case, the stroke may have disrupted certain memory retrieval circuits, particularly those related to spatial recall and both short-term and long-term memory. However, other networks involved in analytical thinking, pattern recognition, and conceptual integration may have become more active during the recovery process. This explanation is consistent with my personal background. For many decades I have trained my brain in pattern recognition through mathematics, physics, engineering, artificial intelligence algorithm design, and medical data analysis. My brain has developed strong internal models for identifying structures, patterns, trends, and relationships across large datasets. These networks were already highly developed long before the stroke occurred. After the stroke, the brain may have compensated for the damaged area by allocating more neural resources to these existing analytical networks. As a result, I now experience a continuous flow of new ideas and conceptual connections. Sometimes when I examine pathophysiological datasets, such as blood glucose or blood pressure charts, I can see the entire pattern almost instantly. Within seconds I understand the current physiological state, the local cause that produced it, the direction in which the system is moving, and the areas that require attention. Another factor may be a temporary reduction in cognitive filtering. Under normal circumstances, the brain filters out a large number of potential thoughts before they reach conscious awareness. This filtering system helps prevent mental overload. However, if some inhibitory circuits are weakened during neurological recovery, more ideas may reach conscious awareness. This could explain why new ideas appear more frequently during my current recovery period. There is also an attentional component. After a major health event such as a stroke, my awareness of internal pathophysiological signals has become much sharper. I constantly observe changes in my body and mind. This heightened awareness allows me to detect subtle patterns that I might have ignored in the past. The creation of a stroke risk triggering sensibility index (TSI) is a good example, which provides an early warning about the upcoming stroke attack. From a scientific perspective, this situation resembles a real-time experiment on neuroplasticity. My brain is simultaneously rebuilding damaged pathways and strengthening alternative networks. Memory retrieval continues to recover gradually through stimulation and experience, while cognitive pattern recognition and idea generation appear to have become more active. This experience reminds me once again that the human brain is an extremely complex and adaptive system. A small structural event can trigger large functional changes, both negative and positive. Although the stroke caused damage to certain parts of my brain, it also revealed the remarkable capacity of the brain to reorganize itself. Conclusion: for me, this process remains mysterious but also deeply fascinating. I continue to observe these changes carefully and document them along the way as part of my ongoing effort to understand the relationship between brain structure, pathophysiological stress, and cognitive function. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. This content is provided for educational reference only and do not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.